Hi there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. What I'm going to do today is something that my colleagues call the water bottle principle. So I recently made a video on the book of Daniel, and I thought that the video was less than ideal. The audio in the background on the video was less than ideal. So I am going to redo the video, and according to the water bottle principle, what that means is you take it to the next level a couple of times. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the book of Daniel, and I'm going to point out to you some prophecies that were fulfilled later. And I'm also going to point out to you some challenges to the dating of the book of Daniel. People who are skeptics have tried to claim that the book of Daniel was written much later than the author of the book of Daniel says it was written. And why do they do that? Because they fear the idea that the Daniel book may have been divinely inspired given its many prophecies. So I'm going to point out a couple of the prophecies that are quite a challenge to skeptics and to people who doubt the legitimacy of the Bible. And then I'm going to also point out the reasons why we should go for the earlier dating in the book of Daniel. And I'm also going to point out some other issues with the book of Daniel. So stay tuned. And I'm also going to tune myself out. So here we go. Let's talk about the book of Daniel. Thank you again for coming in. The prophet Daniel lived between 605 and 530 BC. He and his fellow Israelites were captives in Babylon under the king Nebuchadnezzar. After correctly explaining one of King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, he was given a position of power under him. King Nebuchadnezzar had a puzzling dream which he couldn't explain. He called on numerous wise men of Babylon, yet no one could tell him his dream. They figured that it was impossible because we can't read others' minds. This angered the king, so he decided to put all of the wise men in Babylon to death. But Daniel stopped him. Daniel interpreted his dreams as follows. Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, the rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So Daniel goes on to explain why this was the case, and you can see the statue here in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds in the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will it take in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Scholars have interpreted the four kingdoms to be Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Jesus appeared during the reign of the Roman Empire. Upon his resurrection, God set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed, one which would last forever. Daniel often prayed to God, and the Lord gave him numerous visions and prophecies. In Daniel 9, Daniel begins with a prayer and a confession to the Lord. He says, "We have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. We have not listened to your servants and the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. Therefore, the curses and sworn judgments written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out on us, because we have sinned against you. For your sake, Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, our God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because you are righteous, but because of your great mercy." The angel Gabriel suddenly appeared to Daniel and gave him a prophecy. Daniel 9:24-27 says, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this: from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to the sacrifice and offering. At the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. According to the Jews for Jesus, 77 of years equals a period of 490 years, which is 70 times 7. A 490-year period was decreed for the accomplishment of the final restoration of Israel. The Jews for Jesus link the purposes of the 77s as follows: 1, to finish transgression, compare with Isaiah 59:20. 2, to make an end of sins, compare with Isaiah 27:9 and Ezekiel 36:25-27, and Jeremiah 31:31-34. 3, to make reconciliation for atonement for iniquity. 4, to bring an everlasting righteousness, compare with Isaiah 1:26, 11:2-5, and 32:17, and Jeremiah 23:5-6, and 33:15-18. And 5, to seal up vision and prophecy, and 6, to anoint a most holy place, the Jewish temple, compare with Ezekiel 40-48. There are several times when the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The first option to start the countdown is 539 BC with the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, which permitted the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. You can reference that in 2 Chronicles 36, 22-23, or Ezra 1, 1-4, and 6, 1-5. A second option is the decree of Darius, king of Persia, which the Israelites continue their building project in 515 BC. Another option is 458 BC, when King Artaxerxes of Persia decreed that any of the Israelites in my kingdom, including the priests and Levites, who volunteer to go to Jerusalem with you, may go. That's reported in Ezra 7:13. The final option is when King Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah to Jerusalem in 444 BC. with letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates for protection to rebuild its structures in the month of Nisan. And this is reported in Nehemiah 2, 1-8. Biblical scholars have supported the latter option and the start date of 444 BC. C. Hayner, who reported this in 1978. The final option seems the most likely because Nehemiah and Ezra were instrumental in rebuilding Jerusalem and bringing back its exiles. With the blessings of King Artaxerxes, Nehemiah traveled to Jerusalem and became its governor in 444 BC. He worked with numerous Israelites to rebuild its walls and structures. Though he faced much opposition, he persisted, knowing his efforts were supported by the Lord. Once the walls were rebuilt, 42,360 exiles returned. Ezra spent much time carefully reading them the book of the law of the Lord. Many seemed unaware of the laws and their many transgressions. They confessed their sins and repented, promising to carefully follow the law in the future by not intermarrying with other groups of people, not working on the Sabbath, and keeping the Lord's house purified. They also purified themselves ceremonially and offered great sacrifices to the Lord. Nehemiah 12:27 says, "At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres." Quote, "The 77s are divided into 3 separate units, 7 sevens, 62 sevens, and 1 7. During the first time period of 49 years, Jerusalem would be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times. The second block of time, 62 sevens, or a total of 434 years, immediately following the first, for a total of 69 sevens, or 483 years. At the end of 483-year period, according to the Jews for Jesus, unto the Messiah, the Prince. In the time of Daniel, people believed years contained only 360 days, which when multiplied by 483 comes to 173,880 days. Dividing that by 365.25 gives us 476 years. Adding that to 444 BC and accounting for no 0 year results in the year 33. According to Hayner, the report to Nehemiah occurred in Chislev, which is November-December of 445, and the decree of Artaxerxes occurred in Nisan 10, which would be March 30th of 444 BC. Using a spring start date in 444 results in the prediction that Jesus would be put to death in the spring of 33. Numerous scholars have supported the following date for Jesus' resurrection, April 3rd of 33. Furthermore, as predicted by Daniel, the temple that had been rebuilt was destroyed by the rulers, the Romans. This event occurred in 70 AD. Now, please reference Malachi 3:1, where it was pointed out that the anointed one would go into the temple. That was the second temple. Note it was destroyed in 70 AD. That means the anointed one, or Jesus, had to come prior to 70 AD, which he did. This is a prophecy, and this is the kind of things that triggers the skeptics. According to some, these skeptics, what they do is because they're triggered by prophecies such as this and many others that happen to be in the book of Daniel, they have tried to rewrite the book of Daniel, claiming that it was written much later, and it was written by somebody who is trying to dupe the people who are following the Bible. According to some, the scholarly consensus on the book of Daniel is that the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. Such a consensus makes me wonder about whether scholarship is controlled by people who are skeptical of the supernatural inferences in Daniel's prophecies. To accept this notion, one would have to believe that the writer of Daniel was intentionally crafting a false narrative and trying to fool his audience into thinking he wrote the text centuries earlier. For centuries, the earlier dating of Daniel was considered a given. The only ancient claimant of this hypothesis is Porphyry, who wrote a book called Against the Christians, which was condemned to be burned by the church in 448 AD. Allegations of later dating died down after that, only to be resurrected by scholars over the past 2 centuries. While even conservative and liberal Christians are split on this issue, the reasoning for conservative rejection of the later dating is quite sound. See McDowell and McDowell, 2017. The book of Daniel begins in 604 BC, which is 18 years prior to the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC. Daniel and several other young men, as reported in 1:4, were deported from Judah to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. The book ends 2 years after the 70 years of exile in 532 BC. The book is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic, yet it contains some Babylonian, Persian, and Greek words. The Aramaic portion is in Daniel 1, 2, 4, and to 728. The first 6 chapters detail historical records of this time period, while chapters 7 to 12 detail Daniel's visions. Perhaps its detailing of historical records led to its classification within the Jewish scriptures as writings instead of prophets. Skeptics have often pointed out this classification to suggest that Daniel's prophecies were of minor importance. It should be noted that Daniel is placed between the books of Esther and Ezra-Nehemiah, which also contain histories and were written in the early Persian period. Lamentations, written by the great prophet Jeremiah, is also in the writings. Furthermore, Jesus, who is considered a Jewish rabbi, referred to Daniel as a prophet in Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14. In his book Against Christians, Porphyry in 285 AD put forth the notion that Daniel was written no earlier than 165 BC. Porphyry made the assertion based on Daniel 11:21, which he believed was a prophecy about Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Porphyry determined that Daniel must have written the book in hindsight, not in advance. Others in recent times have jumped onto Porphyry's bandwagon, making similar claims of later dating. These later dating scholars are biased by their refusal to acknowledge fulfilled prophecies. If we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which scholars believe are dated around 150 BC, skeptics would have said Daniel was written after 70 AD, when the temple was obliterated, just as he prophesied in 927. We have numerous reasons to believe the book of Daniel was written when Daniel said it was written, between 604 BC and 532 BC. I will list a few. For one, Daniel refers to himself in the first person in much of the book and makes the dating claim himself. Second, the languages are written in a way which is consistent with the ancient forms of the languages in those centuries. They were not written in a way consistent with dating around 165 BC. According to Wilson in 1997, the Aramaic of Daniel aligns with orthography, syntax, and etymology with Egyptian papyri of the 5th century BC and of the Aramaic of the North Semitic inscriptions of the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BC. Wilson notes that Daniel has a mixture of Hebrew, Persian, and Babylonian words and differs from the Aramaic of the Nabateans. The Nabateans also spoke Aramaic, yet this group of Arabs was not established until the 3rd century BC. Numerous scholars have identified Old Persian words that were no longer in use in the 2nd century BC. One example is the word Ashpenaz in 1-3, which was unknown in the 2nd century and translated as a personal name with an unknown meaning at that time in the Jewish scriptures. Yet it meant innkeeper in the earlier century. Skeptics also point to musical instruments mentioned in Daniel. Here's a picture of Porphyry, just in case you're curious if there's anything out there on him. Here's some information on some of the Old Persian. And then here's some information on the Greek. Skeptics point out these musical instruments, suggesting that they were Greek in origin and therefore not likely to be in Babylon. Kitchen states, and I'll quote, "Only 3 words of one class music are involved. Greek wares reached all over the region. The ancient Near East from the 8th century onwards. Greek mercenaries and artisans served the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. Greek words occur in Imperial Aramaic at the end of the 5th century BC, and there is nothing to stop them appearing earlier. It is unjustifiable to hold that Greek words in Aramaic imply a date after 330 BC. Many Old Persian words, alongside hardly any Greek words in our text, suggest a date in the Persian age. A document of Hellenistic date with a penchant for loanwords should have taken them from Greek or Middle Persian. Hence, a 2nd century date cannot be based on 3 Greek words. A very late 6th century date is early enough for the body of Persian words. Between these dates, no greater precision is possible linguistically. According to Lau, 1999, Greek words are explainable since the famous Orientalist W.F. Albright demonstrated that Greek culture penetrated the ancient Near East long before the Neo-Babylonian period. Another quote from Archer, 1998, "But since we now possess less than 1/10 of the significant Greek literature of the classical period, we lack sufficient data for timing the precise origin of any particular word or usage in the development of the Greek vocabulary. It should carefully be observed that these 3 words are names of musical instruments, and that such names have always circulated beyond national boundaries, as the instruments themselves have become available to the foreign market. These 3 words were undoubtedly of Greek origin and circulated with their Greek names in the Near Eastern markets, just as foreign musical terms have made their way into our own language, like the Italian piano or viola." Steinman in 2008 states, "The best that can be said about linguistic evidence is that it suggests that Daniel was not written before about 560 BC and not later than 300 BC. Lau states, "Furthermore, Daniel is linguistically quite similar to Ezra, and both books are in Hebrew and Aramaic." The bilingual composition of Ezra cannot be explained only on the basis of presence of some official Aramaic letters, because the Aramaic text often extends beyond those letters intended to be rendered in their original language, just as in the book of Daniel. and the first official letter, the famous Decree of Cyrus, is rendered in Hebrew. Moreover, the first change from Hebrew to Aramaic occurs in precisely the same literary manner, which is a proof that the term Tamira in Daniel 2:4 cannot be considered a later insert to indicate a late redaction, say after the loss of the original language text. It is rather a mask or mark of authenticity, and you can compare the passages in Ezra 4:6-7 and Daniel 2:4. Additionally, in the 2nd century, Greek was one of the primary languages spoken. So it is odd that Greek is not a substantial language used in the 2nd century book of Daniel. Kitchen states, but when Alexander and his successors took over the Orient by 330 BC and following, the role of Aramaic as the language of government must have declined visibly. The official tongue of the new rulers was Greek. Kitchen and others have studied Aramaic in Daniel, noting it as imperial Aramaic. Within imperial Aramaic, it is tempting to classify this or that minor peculiarity as hinting that this or that document shows east or west connections, but by and large, this is still unconvincing. In biblical Aramaic, word order in sentences having finite verbs is quite different from normal Northwest Semitic usage: verb, subject, object, etc. Instead, we find the subject commonly first with the verb at the end of a sentence, having only the object more often before than after, i.e. subject, object, verb, or subject, verb, object. This stands in striking contrast to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Genesis Apocryphon, of about the 1st century BC, and Targum of Job of the late 2nd century BC, both of them embarrassingly close in time to a supposedly 2nd century Daniel. But it agrees well with the word order of the Assur-Ostracon of the 7th century BC, and with the freedom of order in the 5th century Aramaic papyri from Egypt. During the reign of Ptolemy II, between 285 and 246 BC, 72 translators translated the Hebrew, the Torah, into Koine Greek in what is called the Septuagint. The rest of the scriptures are believed to have been translated by 150 BC. The book of Daniel also exhibits familiarity with the culture of his time. He referred to Belshazzar as a king in Daniel 5:1, as Belshazzar was a co-regent with Nabonidus. Belshazzar offered to make Daniel the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom in Daniel 5:16, implying the highest and second highest were occupied by Nabonidus and Belshazzar. BiblicalArchaeology.org listed 50 biblical figures who have been supported with archaeological evidence. A Neo-Babylonian text has been found that refers to Belshazzar as the crown prince. Additionally, the ancient historian Josephus recorded in Against Appian that the canon of the Jewish scriptures was closed at the reign of Artaxerxes, which is between 465 and 425 BC. We have to take this sort of thing seriously. Josephus is a well-respected Jewish historian, and he says as follows: "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses, which contain his laws and traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. This interval of time was little short of 3,000 years. But as to the time from the death of Moses till the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets who were after Moses wrote down what was done in their times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. It is true, our history hath been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, but hath not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there hath not been an exact succession of prophets since that time, and how firmly we have given credit to these books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages as have already passed, no one has been so bold as either to add anything to them, to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. But it is become natural to all Jews immediately, and from their very birth, to esteem these books to contain divine doctrines, and to persist in them, and, if occasion, be willingly to die for them." End quote. In Antiquities of the Jews, 11:8, the historian Josephus recounted a visit by Alexander the Great to Jerusalem around 332, and he specifically mentioned the book of Daniel. This can't, again, be taken lightly. These Late daters are not paying attention to the sorts of things that are out there in ancient times. What does it say in Antiquities of the Jews? And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him, and bid them ask what favors they pleased him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. Ezekiel further mentions Daniel 3 times. In Ezekiel 28:3, he said, "Are you wiser than Daniel? Is no secret hidden from you?" In Ezekiel 14:14, he said, "Even if these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could save only themselves by their righteousness, declares the sovereign Lord." In Ezekiel 14:20, he said, "As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, they could save neither son nor daughter. They would save only themselves by their righteousness." Ezekiel was written between 593 and 565 BC. Some try to claim that Ezekiel was referring to Daniel, who appears in the tale of Agate, an ancient Ugaritic epic. Yet Daniel, in that epic, is an idolater. Ezekiel points to a righteous Daniel. Skeptics also make the argument that Daniel got the history wrong when Daniel referred to Belshazzar's father as Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 5:13 and indicated that Belshazzar was the king just before being overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. The generic term for father also meant ancestor. Belshazzar was the heir descendant and eventual successor to the throne. Compare this with the reference to Jesus as the son of David. Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather through Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Nitocris. Belshazzar had thrown a lavish party for his friends with silver and gold wine goblets he had stolen from the Jewish temple. A hand suddenly appeared on the wall, writing, "Mene, mene, tekel peres." The hand frightened Belshazzar, and no one present could interpret its meaning. Daniel 5:7-12 states, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have gold chains placed around his neck, and he will be made to the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, and they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." The king offered Daniel the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom, since he and his father were in the 2 highest positions, if he correctly interpreted the words. Daniel 5:26-28 said, "Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." Critics point to a record written by Berosus around 281 BC, which included a fragment that was written by Josephus to claim Belshazzar was never the king. Berosus claimed that Nebuchadnezzar died after reigning as the king for 43 years, and he was followed by his son Evil-Merodach, Neriglissar, Labashi-Marduk, and Nabonidus followed. Berosus also claimed that Nabonidus reigned for 17 years before fleeing from Babylon and eventually surrendering to Cyrus the Persian. And here's a quote from Burstein, 1978. "In the 17th year of his reign, Cyrus, after he had come out of Persia with a great army and subdued all the rest of the kingdom, advanced against Babylonia. On learning of the invasion, Nabonidus met him with an army and opposed him in battle. After being defeated, he fled with a small retinue and took refuge within the city of the Borsipians. Cyrus, meanwhile, seized Babylon and ordered that the outer walls of the city be thrown down because the city seemed to him to be the very formidable and hard to capture. Cyrus then marched on Borsippa and lay siege to Nabonidus. Nabonidus, however, did not wait the siege, but surrendered himself first. Dealing with him in a gracious manner, Cyrus granted him Carmania as his residence and sent him out of Babylonia. King Darius, however, took away part of his province for himself. Nabonidus, therefore, died after spending the remainder of his life in this country. Yet note that Berosus's work contained flaws. According to Burstein in 1978, even in its present fragmentary state, the Babylonica contains a number of surprising errors of simple fact, of which certainly the most flagrant is the statement that Nabopolassar ruled Egypt. Beyond revealing such slips, the fragments allow no doubt that Berosus offered only the most superficial explanations of the events he recorded and made no attempt to compensate for the biases of his sources. In a historian, such flaws would be damning, but then Berosus's purpose was not historical, it was apologetic. He intended that his book would change Greek ideas about Babylon, and this it signally failed to do. End quote. For thousands of years, we had no record other than Daniel of Belshazzar as the king. So claims that Daniel got the history wrong abounded. That changed in 1851, though, when the Nabonidus cylinder was excavated. The clay cuneiform cylinder listed Belshazzar as regent in Babylon while his father was absent, and his father was Nabonidus. Daniel was absolutely correct. The order of the kings is as follows: Nebuchadnezzar from 605 to 561, Evil Merodach from 561 to 560, Neriglissar from 560 to 556, Labashi Marduk in 556, Nabonidus in 556 to 538, Belshazzar co-regent with Nabonidus in 553 to 539. These are just a few of the many reasons to reject the notions that Daniel was written no earlier than 165 BC and contains historical flaws. According to McDowell and McDowell, there is indeed evidence that Daniel is rooted firmly within the historical milieu, during which it presents itself as having been written. But consider that even if the book were written so late, it still contained prophecies of specific dating that Jesus fulfilled, as noted at the outset. Did the Jews ever consider Daniel a prophet? In the Christian Bible, Daniel is listed with the prophets. Yet in the Jewish Tanakh, Daniel is listed in the writings, not in the 8 books of the prophets. The Jewish Tanakh is divided into 3 categories: the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy; the 8 books of the prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets; and the 11 books of the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Jesus seemed to acknowledge this division in Luke 24:44. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Yet Jesus also acknowledged that Daniel is a prophet. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Further, he referenced himself in Mark 14:62, coming in the clouds of glory. The Jewish historian Josephus also referenced Daniel in Antiquities of the Jews. He recounted a visit by Alexander the Great to Jerusalem around 332 BC, as mentioned earlier, and specifically mentioned the book of Daniel in 11:8 to 15, when he recounted how Alexander the Great read about himself in the book of Daniel. Reference 7:6, 8:3 to 8, 20 to 22, and 11:8. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, considered Daniel a prophet. Says, and I quote, "But I do not think proper to relate it, since I have only undertaken to describe things past, or things present, but not things that are future. Yet if anyone be so very desirous of knowing truth, as not to waive such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of futurity, and whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings." When he, referring to Nebuchadnezzar, had seen this dream, he called the magicians together again, and inquired of them about it, and desired them to tell him what it signified. But when none of them could find out the meaning of the dream, nor discover it to the king, Daniel was the only person that explained it, and as he foretold, so it came to pass. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date to the 2nd century BC, Daniel is also referred to as a prophet. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, it states as follows: to seal up the vision and prophecy. Vision and prophecy were Hazon, Navi, and this is written in Daniel 9:24. The word hazon refers to a vision, and Navi refers to a prophet. Some of the prophets in the Jewish scriptures who are referenced as Navi are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, and Zechariah. Prophets were not called Navi who were included in the book of prophets are Amos, Hosea, Joel, Jonah, Malachi, Micah, Obadiah, and Zephaniah. In other words, the book of prophets includes 9 unnamed prophets and excludes 1 named prophet, Daniel. Seems a little strange, doesn't it? Furthermore, Daniel is referenced 3 times in Ezekiel within the book of prophets. Ezekiel called Daniel wise and righteous. Daniel was clearly respected by both his peers and those in the years that follow through the 1st century. So why did he get demoted? The Talmud is a comprehensive written version of Jewish commentary and oral law, which include the Mishnah and the Gemara. The book was compiled between the 2nd and 5th centuries after Jesus' resurrection. In the Babylonian Talmud, Megillah 3:1, the authors claim that Daniel was not a prophet. They said, "It is written, and I, Daniel, saw alone this appearance, but the men that were with me did not see the appearance. Nevertheless, a great terror fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Who were these men?" said R. Jeremiah, according to others, Arhiah, and B. Abba. They were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They were better than he because they were prophets, and he, Daniel, was not a prophet. And he was better than they because he saw it, and they did not see it. But if they did not see, why fell a terror upon them? Although they did not see literally, they saw it clairvoyantly, said Rabina. From this, we may infer that whoso is terrified, although he does not himself see, he sees clairvoyantly. Another quote, evidently Daniel was greater than these prophets, and they're referencing again Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And all the more so he was greater than Nehemiah, who was never privileged to prophecy. Apropos Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the Gemara notes, in certain respects the latter 3 were greater than Daniel, and in certain respects Daniel was greater than the latter 3. They were greater than he, as they were prophets, and he was not a prophet. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were designated to transmit their visions of God to the Jewish people, but Daniel was not designated to share his visions with others, and he was greater than they, as he saw this vision, and they did not see this vision, according to the Sanhedrin 93b and 94a. So why did the Jews demote Daniel the prophet? Given evidence that Daniel was revered as a prophet during his own time, in the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the time of Jesus, and in the time of Josephus, one wonders why he was suddenly demoted to non-prophet status. It seems likely that when the Jews realized that Daniel's prophecies of the Anointed One had been fulfilled, rather than admit he was a prophet and that they had missed the coming of their Savior, they demoted him. In Sanhedrin 97a and 97b, their reasoning is made clear. The school of Eliyahu taught 6,000 years is the duration of the world. 2,000 of the 6,000 years are characterized by chaos, and that's from Adam to Abraham. 2,000 years are characterized by Torah, from the era of the patriarchs until the end of the Mishnaic period, from Abraham to the Anno Domini area. And 2,000 years are the period of the coming of the Messiah. That is the course that history was to take. But due to our sins, that time frame increased. The Messiah did not come after 4,000 years passed, and furthermore, the years that elapsed since then, which were to have been the Messianic era, have elapsed. So why did the Jews who wrote the Talmud recognize Jesus as the Messiah? Numerous times in the Old Testament, read that only a remnant of Israel would recognize Jesus. The rest would not recognize Jesus as a Messiah. The rest would have eyes and ears, but they wouldn't be able to hear, according to Psalm 135. I really appreciate that you came by today. Please like and subscribe, and do come again. You can reach me on Twitter at LEAD1225, or you can reach me at my website at Christian-apologist.com. Thank you. Bye-bye.